Hey guys, welcome back. So this was supposed to be a video on my experiences with going to a psychiatric ward, and honestly, I'm going to make that video. That will be the video after this one um, that I post. Um, but I wanted to do a different video today, and I wanted to talk about my experience of coming out of a cultist organization. Now, if anybody who knows me who's still a part of the organization I was a part of, or the church I was a part of, I'm not going to say their church name. I'm not going to mention any of the people in the church um, because of privacy reasons. I'm very, 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 um, what's the word I'm looking for? Let's just say I'm very big into confidentiality, right? So I'm not here to embarrass anybody. Um, I'm not here to really put down. Um, but if any of them watch this, or anybody who is still a part of the kind of church that I went to, um, they will tell you they're not a cult. And I agree. I don't think a lot of people that I know who uh, came out of the church will, or the type of church that I went to, will say that it is a cult. Um, but because they have open door policies, I'm gonna call them a cultist organization, okay? Because to me, that's what they fall under, is a cultist organization. That they have cult-like features, but they're not necessarily full-blown cults. Um, I came from what was originally a church, a part of what was called the UPC, which stands for the United Pentecostal Church. And then we turned into independent, um, an independent Pentecostal church about how many years ago? 4 years ago, because we had another pastor who was pastoring our church for a good, at least while I was there for 13 years. I was a Pentecostal for 13 years, and um, we had I served under the first pastor for about 10 to 11 of those years, and we were UPC for a time. And then I remember towards the end of his pastoralship, we went independent. Um, and the church under the pastor who leads it now, they are still independent, which to me, independent Pentecostal churches are a lot more dangerous than the United Pentecostal Church, because at least if they were under the United Pentecostal Church, they had some accountability, some rules and regulations that they had to uphold to. But being independent, um, you can make any rules you want. You can make any stipulations, any dogmas. You can make just really anything, and the preachers aren't accountable to anybody because they're independent. They're not under anybody's authority. They're under their own authority. Um, so to me, that makes the independent churches a lot more dangerous than being part of the UPC. But they're both dangerous in their own right. And so, like I said before, I was Pentecostal, and I think I think Pentecostalism is cultish, when it comes down to a lot of things, especially when it comes down to a lot of their standards and their rule sets, because a lot of their standards and rule sets, one, don't even make sense, and two, are based around control and manipulation to the point where the people following those rules and standards don't even see that they're being manipulated into following them, and they're being controlled into following them. They just see it as this is how we live life, um, because there's a lot of psychology that goes on um, behind the scenes from the preachers of these churches that I see, and that a lot of people who left see, and that the people who are in it just either they don't see it or they're not willing to see it. Um, so yeah, I was Pentecostal, and I was under a pretty hardcore Pentecostal church for 10 years. It's a lot less hardcore now over there at the church that I left. Um, and it's a lot easier, I think, but I still felt the need to leave because I didn't agree with um, their a lot of their standards and rule sets. I didn't agree with their dogmas. I didn't agree their with a lot of their doctrines anymore, and I didn't agree with how things are run, not just in that particular church, but in Pentecostal churches and in Pentecostalism in general. Um, I think it's just an extreme form of Christianity, in my opinion. And yeah, it's not good. And I don't recommend anybody who's looking for a church and who's looking for God to go to a Pentecostal church or to an apostolic church for that fact. Um, so I was, yeah, Pentecostal for 13 years, um, and I was pretty faithful to it. Um, I left the church one time about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I want to say about 2.5 years ago, right? And then they kind of guilted me into going back after I um, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. They scared me into going back, and so I went back because I thought God was punishing me, and because that's the way they made it seem like it was. Come to find out, that God had nothing to do with it, um, but that's how they made me feel, and a lot of the reasons why I left was because of the way they treated me, because I have a mental health disability. Um, and the way I was treated by certain people for that, but there were a lot bigger reasons why I left, because really I don't hold any bitterness against any of the people I went to church with. I don't hold any animosity towards them. I don't hold any anger or resentment with them. I still love and appreciate all of them, and they're still my friends in my opinion. If they want to still be my friend, I'm not against it. But if they don't want to be my friend simply because I chose to lead a different life outside of the church, then, and they don't want to be my friends, well, then I guess they don't have to be my friends. I'm not forcing anybody to be my friend or talk with me or hang out with me at all. Um, and that's the thing with these organizations and why I consider them cultist organizations, because when a person leaves, they just forget about you. They just forget about you and you're dust in the wind, you know. And a lot of these churches preach that you shouldn't even talk to people who left the church. You shouldn't fellowship with them, um, which is kind of strange because there are a couple of people, and again, I won't say who I went to the church with, who have come over to my house to talk with me, who I've gone out to eat with since leaving. And I'm pretty sure if the preacher of the church found out that they hung out with me, they would get yelled at and they would get put down for hanging out with a backslider and hanging out with what they would call a wolf, right? Which I don't understand why I'd be labeled that, seeing as I've never done anything to try to get anybody out of the church or get them to think any differently about their belief system, because what I believe is completely up to me. But I just wanted, yeah, my nose itches. Um, I just wanted to make this short video about why I left the organization. And like I said, I left Pentecostalism behind because they're very legalistic, they're very dogmatic, they're very controlling and manipulative. And there's a lot of brainwashing that goes on. And the preachers know that there is. But unbeknownst to the people in the congregation, um, you know, it, they don't see it. Um, for example, one thing that I've come to not agree with is their dress standards. Um, if you're gonna be in a Pentecostal church, you have to live by certain dress standards, especially for women. It's preached really hard against women than it is for men. Women can't wear makeup, they can't wear jewelry, and they can't wear pants. They have to wear dresses or skirts, and the dresses and skirts have to come below mid-calf, and they can't cut their hair. And for men, men have to cut their hair, can't grow it long for any kind of length. It has to be shaven. Um, this beard, facial hair for men is not allowed. It's preached against, and you will get yelled at and scorned for having facial hair, even if it's just a 5 o'clock shadow because you forgot to shave that day. And other people in the church will come up to you like, "Ooh, you didn't shave," It's so stupid. It's like it's like being in a place full of little kids when it comes down to the rules. Like just the rules and the regulations and the dress standards, just it's all based around control. It really is. And they like to take scriptures here and there from the Bible, um, and try to back up what they preach, at least when it comes to standards. And it doesn't work because they don't see that a lot of their standards are based around culture and not scripture. Because the thing when it comes to women not wearing pants, right? Here's my thing, is I don't see why women wearing pants is wrong. They want to use this thing that, oh, because it splits the legs, which who gives a rat's ass, right? I don't get what that has to deal with anyways, because skin splits the legs naturally anyways, right? So I mean, that doesn't make sense right off the bat. And so what makes sense that we'd have to wear clothing that doesn't split the legs? And if that's true, why does the same not apply to men? If splitting the legs is such a big deal, then shouldn't men be covering up in long flowing garments too? Doesn't that make us immodest for wearing pants also? Um, so that doesn't make sense. Then they got this thing that, well, men and women shouldn't look the same, and they got this thing that they say, oh, well, if women wear pants, they're looking like men and they're dressing like men because pants are men's apparel and dresses and skirts are women's apparel. And they take this from a 1600s culture, right? even at 1800s culture. We'll go as early as the 1800s, and they still abide by 1800s culture. And to me, that's what women wearing pants comes down to, is just a cultural thing. Um, and they're still living in their own culture, the Pentecostals are, where women have to wear dresses and skirts. Because in the Bible, they try to use First Timothy, is it Second Timothy or First Timothy? I don't even know the scripture off the top of my head, so I do apologize for that. I should know it by now. But in one of the books of Timothy, I think in the 9th chapter, and I can't remember what verse, it talks about women. God, I can't even remember the verse off the top of my head. It talks about women having to wear modest apparel. We'll just put it that way, right? Um, and they say, well, look, the Bible says modest apparel, and when you look up the Greek definition of modest apparel, it means a long flowing garment. And my rebuttal to that is this: is the women back then in Jesus's time, right, and in the apostles' time, wore long flowing garments. The women did. And guess what? So did the men. The men wore tunics, right? So women also wore these tunics, but in a different style and a different fashion. But the thing is both men and women wore these long flowing garments. I mean, sometimes men would have the shorter garments, yeah, but they were robes. I mean, men and women both wore robes back then. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense to say that why men and women can't wear pants today. Um, be, because, I mean, if we're going to go by biblical standards, then if women should be wearing long robes, then so should men, because that's what men wore back in biblical times too, if we're going to get biblical about it. And it just doesn't make sense to me. Because robes are robes, right? And the tunics were tunics, whether they were in different styles and different makes, um, they were one and the same. Just there were a distinction between men's tunics, and there was a distinction between the tunics that women wore. But men and women both wore long flowing garments back then. Um, and if you want to say that men and women both have to be modest, then by the Greek definition and the biblical definition of modest apparel, if men should also wear modest apparel, then men should also be wearing dresses and skirts. If we're going to go by that scripture, and we're going to say men should also dress modestly. Um, and you know what? So we go back to the thing with pants, right? And it is true that pants started off as a men's clothing article, but women in the culture in the 1930s, right, when World War II came around, women had to work in the factory, so they started wearing pants there, and women found them more comfortable sometimes, and they found them more desirable and easy to use around the house when working in the house and working in the garden, right? They didn't get caught up on things. They could climb ladders that they needed to climb to get up to higher reaching things without tripping over their dresses and their skirts and without getting in the way. So they just started wearing the pants in regular culture too, because it was easier for them to do certain things in pants than it was in a skirt. So women decided that wearing pants should be a cultural norm. And in the culture, that's when culture, right, changed. And women started wearing pants. And ever since that cultural change, there has always been pants designed for men. And there has always been pants designed for women, right? You're not going to walk out and see a man wearing a woman's jeans, right? That's designed for a woman these days, right? So, I mean, there's a distinction between men's designs and women's designs. When you go into clothing stores, you got the men's section of men's pants and the women's section of women's pants. And I just, to me, on that note, like with that standard, I don't see what the big deal is. I don't see why in the Pentecostal churches that women are forced to wear skirts and dresses, and they don't have the option of wearing pants if they so choose. Um, it's like women's rights don't exist in the church because men have so much power in the church. Um, I mean they're kind of living back in the 1600s esque type of era. You know, even in like old old England and the 1700s early America. You know, um, they're kind of still living in this mindset of that era, and they refuse to see that a lot of the things they do are dogmatic, and they're very much cultural issues, and they choose to segregate their culture from our culture, from modern day culture, and they want to live this old style of culture for some reason. And I remember, like, even with the men, like, you had to wear your button-up shirts. You had to wear all your shirts had to be tucked in. Um, if your shirts weren't tucked in, even if they weren't button-up shirts, you would get reprimanded for it. And it's like, what? Like, why can't I wear my shirt untucked just because the preacher doesn't like the style? You know, or just because people in the world wear their shirts untucked. I mean, people in the world wear their shirts tucked in too. You go to freaking work, right? And the men tuck in their dress shirts. That's when, and careers are worldly too, right? So, I mean, what's the big deal? Um, it's just a lot of things didn't make sense, and there were other things like speaking in tongues, which I no longer believe in. Um, you know, that's another doctrine they had, that where salvation was required upon it, almost in a lot of churches. Um, I don't know if in my church if they necessarily required speaking in tongues to be a part of your salvation, but they certainly made you feel like it should have been that way. Like if you didn't speak in tongues, there was something wrong with you. Um, even though Paul is clear in the Bible that not everybody speaks in tongues, but yet they expected everybody to speak in tongues, and if you didn't, you were weird. You were the outcast. Um, Tithing was another doctrine that I don't believe in. It's an Old Testament rule, it's an Old Testament law, and they preach it in the church today, in the modern day Christian church, which it was never meant for. So that's something I didn't agree with, and another reason why I left. Um, you know, there was just a lot of control. Like I said, control with the way people dressed. There was control with the way you lived your life inside and outside the church. I mean, you weren't even allowed to have friends outside of the inner circle of the people you went to church with. People outside of church were just tolerated, like people at your work. You tolerated them, but you didn't necessarily make friends with them. You know, you weren't supposed to, because they were toxic to your walk with God and to your faith, and they were going to lead you astray if you were to get close to them. Um, and I never made friends outside of the church, but yet uh, here I am not in that church organization anymore, right? So I came to my own conclusions. So I brought myself out of it. It wasn't because of the influence of anybody outside of the church. I left on my own accord because I started seeing things. And so, Yeah, I could go into deeper detail about a lot of the things about the Pentecostal church, but I mean, I don't personally want to be under something that's so controlling towards people and controlling towards what they do and so brainwashing. I mean, when I talk to my parents about things, they're so brainwashed in the way they believe. Like, and half the stuff they believe, they only believe it because it's what they're told to do. That's what it comes down to. Every time they tell me something, it's because, oh, that's the way it's supposed to be, or that's what we're taught. And that's all that it has to be, is there's no questions behind it. And that was always another thing in the Pentecostal church, is that you never question the pastor and what he preaches and what he teaches. You never question it. It's what he says is set in stone, and what he says is real and truthful, and you believe it. And I found that to be a very dangerous practice, that we weren't allowed to formulate and have our own opinions and beliefs. So I left. Um, and that's always the thing with them is, oh, well, it's what we're taught. And a lot of them don't even know why they believe in what they're taught. Um, and it's really sad, in my opinion, that these people aren't allowed to formulate their own thoughts. They're not allowed to formulate their own opinions about anything. They just live their life based around what the preacher tells them to do and how the preacher says they're supposed to live their life. And to me, that's very dangerous, and that's what makes it a cultist organization, in my opinion, is that this one man has so much control over the people. Um, and that's how cults run. And actually, we did something in psychology. Let me grab my notebook, right? Um, we learned in psychology yesterday, um, that there's these organizations that exist called groupthink. And groupthink is the label given to organizations that think as a collective group and don't think outside of what the leaders tell them to do. And it hit Pentecostalism on the mark. It says groupthink: when members of the group are overly concerned with maintaining group cohesiveness and cordiality, interfering with the members' abilities to critically examine any problems. And that's Pentecostalism in a nutshell. I mean, they're a very cohesive group. They're very exclusive to themselves, and anybody who's not a part of their church and this exclusivity is gets other labels onto them, right? And it does interfere with these people's ability to critically think or examine anything. And they don't examine any of the teachings they've been taught. They don't examine what's being said behind the pulpit. I mean, half the time the preacher's preaching, they're screaming, they're yelling, they're jumping up and down, and you can't understand a word he's saying, but yet half the church is standing up saying amen and praise Jesus, and they don't even know what's being said because you can't understand it. They're just getting all up in the hype. And that's what a lot of the preachings and teachings come down to, is just a lot of it is just hype. It's a lot of mob mentality that goes on in the Pentecostal church, and a lot of people don't even know what they believe in. They think they know why they believe what they believe, but they really don't. And it goes on to say that the traits of group thinkers are people who are groups of people who are highly cohesive. They insulate they insulate group members from outside sources, which is what I was going back to, where anything the preacher says goes, right? And you can't have friends and family outside of the group. Uh, the only important people that exist, and the only true friends you'll ever have, are your church family. That's what they teach. That your family that your own blood and relatives are never going to be as close to you as your church family is, and that's scary. That's kind of dangerous. Um, they have highly directive leaders who make their wishes known, and that is very true. Is anything the preacher wants, the preacher gets. Anything the preacher says, the people do, and he makes it very known of what his his goals are. He makes it known of what his, like it says here, his wishes are, and how he wants your life to be, and how he wants you to live your life. And a lot of different areas his wishes are known. Number 4, the lack of systematic procedures to evaluate both the pros and cons of any certain decisions. That's a big part of the Pentecostal churches. And the illusions of invulnerability, right? That that they are almighty and that they are holier than thou art. That mentality, that thought of invulnerability, that nothing can touch them. And and it's just, Pentecostalism is a scary um, sect of Christianity because they're very extreme. And I've already gone long enough in this video. It's been 30 minutes, so I'm probably going to cut it off here. But if anybody wants to know anything about Pentecostalism and the organization itself, and the different types of Pentecostalism and what they believe, I can get into greater detail about what they teach and what they preach. Um, but that's not really the main staple of this channel. There's a one of my friends, his name is Ralph Brickley, and he has a channel called Divide the Word blog on YouTube. And if you want to know in depth pretty much about what Pentecostal churches teach and how they run things, he does very good videos on those. And you could go over there to Divide the Word blog and watch his videos on and kind of figure out what the Pentecostal church is like through that. And there's also another channel called We Left Legalism by another set of friends I have who also do the same type of thing. But that's not really the main staple on my channel. My channel's main staple is mental health and psychology. But I will talk about the cultist organization I came from called the Pentecostal Church, right? The Independent Pentecostal Church. Because they do psychologically and mentally abuse people, and these people don't even know they're being psychologically and mentally and even emotionally abused. Um, it's called spiritual abuse, and the preachers know they're doing this, and some of the preachers do it so well that some of them don't know they do that, but they do. Um, but I really think a lot of pastors are aware that they do these kinds of things to people, that they are spiritually abusive towards their people, and the people in turn are spiritually abusive towards each other. Um, so it does tie into mental health. Um, and I believe a lot of the reasons why I developed schizophrenia was because the prolonged psychological abuse I received in the church um, got to my brain and messed something up. So I do blame a lot, not all of the reasons why schizophrenia developed in me, but I do blame some of the reasons of why I developed schizophrenia on my experiences in the church and the psychological abuses that and emotional abuses that I received there. Um, so any questions about Pentecostalism and the independent Pentecostal churches, and what they're like and what we were taught and what it's like to be in one of those churches, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions about those. So leave those down in the comments section below, and maybe I'll get into a little depth and a little detail about more about why. This was just a basic overview about why I left the Pentecostal church. Very basic. I didn't really even get into much. Um, but maybe I can make more videos going into detail about why I left the Pentecostal church. Um, but I mean, it does tie into my mental health. So I thought I'd talk about it. And yeah, so I mean, if you have any questions about it, feel free to let me know, and I'd be more than willing to answer. So this has been just a brief overview of why I decided to leave the Pentecostal church. Um, because they're very legalistic, because they're dogmatic, and because they're very controlling and manipulative. Um, and because I don't agree with a lot of their doctrines anymore either. So those are all the reasons of why I decided to leave. Um, and The next video I put out will be on one of my viewers, Manny, asked me about if I can make a video describing what it was like being in the psychiatric ward. So look forward, if you're interested in what it's like to be in a psychiatric ward, look forward to that video, because I'm going to be talking all about what it's like to be in a psychiatric facility and my experiences there. And everybody's experience in a psychiatric ward is going to differ from mine, because not all psychiatric wards are the same. They're all different, and your experiences as an individual are different. So, but I will talk about my personal experience in it, so that'll be the next video. Again, thanks for stopping by, and we'll catch you next time.